Hi, scholars. I'm excited to be with you today. Today, we're going to be reading the book called To Mrs. Gibsons. Before we look at the front cover, we're going to do three things together. One, I'm going to ask you a question, then I'm going to share an important word with you, and then we're going to talk about the genre of this book. So, my question for you is what do you like to do with your family? And if you have a chance, share your idea with someone sitting next to you. Great. For me, I really enjoy doing lots of things with my family. My love language is quality time, so really anything that we do together, I really enjoy. Whether that's taking a walk with Kekoa, or learning how to cook, or playing our new favorite game, Ticket to Ride. So thinking about your answer to this question is going to help you understand this character. The second thing we're going to talk about is an important word. This important word is origami. Can you say that with me? Origami. Origami is the art of folding paper. So when I looked at the front cover, I noticed that there's paper here that's folded into what looks like to be a bird. So I'm wondering if this character here likes to do origami. The third thing we're going to talk about is the genre in this book. This book is fiction, which means that the author imagined the story in their brain. So let's take a look now at the front cover. I got a head start and shared one noticing wondering that I was having, but now I want you to do the same and turn to someone sitting next to you to share your idea. Great. I'm noticing that there's one character here. I'm noticing that this character has more busy melanin, but the author didn't tell me how this character identified, so I don't know this character's race identity yet. I know that this character's gender identity is a girl, and I know that their age identity is a child. I'm still wondering if this character enjoys doing origami, and I'm also wondering who are the two Mrs. Gibsons. Great, so now let's get started. To Mrs. Gibsons. This book was written by Toyomi Igus and illustrated by Dara Wells. I once knew two Mrs. Gibsons. It sounds like the little girl is the one that's speaking here. This Mrs. Gibson was tall. Her skin was the color of chocolate. She was born in America in a place called Tennessee. This Mrs. Gibson was small. Her skin was the color of vanilla. She was born in Japan in a place called Gifu. It sounds like the author is sharing with us that the two Mrs. Gibsons had different melanin, they're of different races, and they're from different places. This Mrs. Gibson gave hugs that were like being wrapped up in a great big fat bearskin rug. Come here and give me some sugar, she would say. This Mrs. Gibson gave hugs that were like being wrapped up in a light, down-filled comforter. And at bedtime, she'd stroke my hair and hum Sakura until I fell asleep. This Mrs. Gibson was loud. She had a big laugh and a big voice, which would get louder when she was angry or when she was singing. And she seemed to be singing all the time. She would sing words that say, "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine." This Mrs. Gibson was quiet. She would cover her mouth when she laughed, so you could never see her teeth. And when she was angry, she'd get even quieter. This Mrs. Gibson had small hands that would make the littlest, prettiest strokes of a pen when she would write our names in Japanese. So the author is sharing a little bit more about this Mrs. Gibson's language identity. The names were Kumiki, Akimi, Toyomi, Yoshiteru. I did my best. This Mrs. Gibson had big hands. They looked like they were covered all the keys of the piano when she played her favorite songs. And she would sing the words, "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine." So it sounds like the author is sharing more about the two Mrs. Gibsons and their interests. So this Mrs. Gibson loved to sing. Because I remember the other page, the author said that she loved to sing all the time. And I learned now that she loves to play the piano too. And this Mrs. Gibson seems to love to write in Japanese. Sometimes this Mrs. Gibson would look kind of sad. When she would let me dress up in one of her kimonos, she had packed away in an old trunk. "These are very special," she would say, as she tied the obi around my waist. "Don't get it dirty." The other Mrs. Gibson's clothes were much too big for me to dress up in, but I liked to wear her fancy hats. "This is my Sunday go meeting hat," she would say, as she'd take the long pointy hat pin out of my hand. "Don't get it dirty," she would say. It sounds like the little girl likes dressing up in both Mrs. Gibson's clothes. And I'm having a text-self connection. When I was little, I used to love doing that too. I used to wear all of my mom's jewelry and my dad's ties. In the evening in the garden, this Mrs. Gibson would help me make magical lamps by catching fireflies and putting them in a jelly jar. They would glow, and then we'd let them go. Later, at dinner time, this Mrs. Gibson would make more magic. Her hands were turning little bits of napkins into a whole flock or group of long-necked cranes. We would throw them in the air, and they would fly high and then flutter down to the ground. Happy birds, she would always say. It sounds like in the evening, the little girl liked to make magic with both Mrs. Gibsons, but they did it in different ways. This Mrs. Gibson would catch fireflies with her, and this Mrs. Gibson would make origami with her. I want you to stop for a second, and I want you to think about and share with someone sitting next to you, if you can. What do you like to do with your family in the evening? Great. This Mrs. Gibson always had a pot of rice cooking. We would eat it with bits of meat and vegetables on it, and plenty of shoyu, or soy sauce. Anytime we were hungry, she would take her long chopsticks and stir up dinner in a blink of an eye. I mean, it's really quickly. This Mrs. Gibson always had a pot of greens cooking. Turnip greens, dandelion greens, mustard greens from the garden. Everything she cooked seemed to take a long, long time. It sounds like both Mrs. Gibsons loved to cook and make food for the little girl. I'm having a text self-connection here. When I was growing up, we'd always have rice cooking too. There would always either be rice that was warmed in the rice pot, or someone would be making rice, and we eat it with every meal. This Mrs. Gibson had short curly hair that she would oil and braid up every night while she listened to the radio. She liked to braid my hair too, but she would always give me one big fat braid that would hang down over my forehead. I didn't like that braid, so I would go to the other Mrs. Gibson and she would take it out. This Mrs. Gibson used to have long, thick, straight hair, but she cut it short and tried to make it curly. This Mrs. Gibson's other name was Kazumi. Everyone called her Kaz or Connie because they couldn't pronounce Kazumi. I called her Mommy because she was my mother. Oh, so now I know how this Mrs. Gibson is connected to the little girl. This was her mom. This Mrs. Gibson's other name was Viola. Everyone called her V or Reverend Gibson because she was a church minister. I called her Nanny because she was my grandmother. Oh, now I know that this Mrs. Gibson was connected to the little girl because this was her grandmother. So now I know more about the little girl's family identity. And I also know that because they're related, that she has roots in Japan because of the mom and in America because of the grandma. I once knew two Mrs. Gibsons. They were very different, but they had a lot in common. They both loved my daddy, and they both loved me. And now that I know more about her family identity, I know more about her race identity, because her mom is Asian and her dad is Black, which means that her race identity is mixed race or multiracial. The end. The agree reader question, scholars, is... How were Mrs. Gibson, the little girl's mom, and the other Mrs. Gibsons, the little girl's grandmother, the same? And if you have a chance, turn to someone sitting next to you to share your idea. And remember that good readers also use evidence from the book to support their idea, whether that's looking at what the illustrator drew or what the author wrote. Great. For me, I think that both Mrs. Gibsons were the same because they both loved the little girl and loved to take care of her. And one way that I learned from the book that they love to take care of her is by feeding her and cooking food for her. When the author wrote, this Mrs. Gibson always had a pot of rice cooking, and this Mrs. Gibson always had a pot of greens cooking. The author was telling me that they both loved to cook rice and greens for the little girl, and that's one thing they had in common. Great. So scholars, your assignment today is to make a text-to-self connection. My question for you is, how are you the same or different than this girl in the story? It may sound like I'm the same as this girl in the story because, or I'm different than this girl in the story because. You can share your ideas by using words, by writing those words, or drawing a picture. For me, I feel like I am the same as this little girl because her mom and her grandma would cook meals for her. And when I was growing up, anytime that I would go to my mom and my mama's house, they would always have food for me. And particularly, they would always cook rice and meat for me at every meal. So I drew a picture to share my idea. I drew a picture of me and the equal sign to represent I am the same as this girl in the story. And then I drew a picture of my mom and my mom cooking rice and meat for me and how this is the same as the little girl's mom, Mrs. Gibson, and how she used to cook meat and rice for her. So scholars, we can't wait to see your answer to the question, how are you the same or different than the little girl in the story? Have a great day. Bye.